There is a specific kind of cruelty that only exists in sports, and it has nothing to do with rivalry. It is not the away crowd jeering the opposing striker. It is the home crowd, the people who paid for the jersey, who stood and sang his name a season ago, turning on their own player, booing him off the pitch, booing the ball every time it reaches his feet, booing a man who is, in that moment, already failing in front of thousands of people, and needs nothing from the crowd except silence. Most people explain this with the easy answer: he is not performing, therefore he deserves it. But that explanation collapses the moment you notice how disproportionate the reaction is. Nobody boos a stranger failing at their job with this intensity. You do not stand outside a restaurant and scream at a waiter for bringing the wrong order. There is something else happening in that stadium, something that has very little to do with football and everything to do with the architecture of the human mind. Carl Jung spent his life studying exactly this kind of behavior, not on the terraces, but in dreams, in myths, in the unconscious material that surfaces whenever people gather in groups and start looking for someone to blame. What happens in that crowd is not really about the player. It is about what the crowd cannot admit about itself, and where all of that unwanted material has to go. Jung used the word persona to describe the mask a person builds for the world, the version of themselves that is presentable, coherent, socially acceptable. A fan's identity is built the same way. Wearing the shirt, knowing the history, defending the club in arguments, all of it becomes a persona, a performance of loyalty that the fan shows to friends, family, co-workers. When the team loses, and loses through one visible player, the persona itself feels threatened. The fan is not just disappointed in a match result, they are watching their own identity, the one they built their belonging around, get humiliated in public. Booing becomes a way of publicly separating the persona from the failure, a way of shouting, "This player does not represent who I am," even though minutes earlier he represented exactly that. The same mechanism shows up at work when a team distances itself loudly from a colleague the moment a project fails, suddenly reminding everyone they always had doubts, protecting the professional mask rather than the person. The shadow, in Jung's model, is everything a person refuses to acknowledge about themselves: the laziness, the fear, the mediocrity, the moments of quitting when it mattered. Most people spend enormous energy keeping the shadow hidden, even from themselves. A stadium is one of the few places where the shadow is allowed to speak without consequence, because it speaks as a crowd, and the crowd absorbs the shame that an individual voice would carry alone. When a fan screams abuse at a player who missed an open goal, they are very often screaming at the exact quality they cannot tolerate in themselves: the failure under pressure, the choking, the visible collapse. The player becomes a screen. The crowd is not reacting to him. They are reacting to their own shadow, finally given a face and a name and a number on a shirt. Projection is the unconscious act of placing an unwanted trait onto someone else so it no longer has to be owned. Jung considered it one of the most common and most destructive psychological defenses, because it feels like clarity while it is actually distortion. The fan who has spent years avoiding risk in his own life, staying in the safe job, never asking for the raise, never taking the shot, will often be the loudest voice condemning a player for playing it safe on the pitch. The contempt is real, but it is misplaced. It belongs to the fan's own unlived life, not to the athlete's 90 minutes. This is the same dynamic that plays out in families, when a parent who abandoned their own ambitions becomes furious at a child for lacking drive, punishing in the child exactly what they never forgave in themselves. Jung borrowed the term participation mystique to describe a state where the boundary between self and other dissolves, where a person feels so merged with something outside themselves that its failures become their own. A fan does not simply support a player; in this state they psychologically fuse with him. His performance becomes an extension of the fan's own sense of worth. This is why a missed penalty can trigger a reaction disproportionate to any rational stake in the outcome. The fan has no salary tied to the result, no career on the line, yet the humiliation feels personal. It is personal because the boundary Jung described has collapsed. The same fusion happens in a marriage when one partner's professional failure is experienced by the other as their own shame, or when a parent feels a child's poor grades as an indictment of their own worth as a parent. Jung took the concept of enantiodromia from Heraclitus, the idea that anything pushed to an extreme eventually turns into its opposite. Adoration that is intense enough always carries the seed of an equally intense contempt, because both emotions draw from the same unconscious well. The crowd that once chanted a player's name with something close to worship is psychologically primed to turn on him with equal ferocity the moment he falls short, not despite the love but because of it. Idolization was never really about the player, it was an unconscious inflation, and inflation always precedes a fall. This is the same pattern in a friendship where someone is placed on a pedestal for years and then discarded viciously after one disappointment. The fall is violent precisely because the elevation was never grounded in reality to begin with. Long before football stadiums existed, communities practiced literal scapegoating, loading the sins of the group onto an animal or a person and driving it out to restore a sense of collective purity. Jung saw this as an archetypal pattern, not a historical accident, a psychological need that repeats itself in new forms across centuries. A struggling player becomes the modern scapegoat. Booing him is not really punishment for missed passes, it is a ritual, an unconscious attempt by the group to expel its collective anxiety, its fear of decline, its embarrassment at losing by concentrating all of it onto one visible target and casting it out through noise. Once he is gone, sold, dropped, substituted, the crowd feels a temporary and false sense of relief, as if the deeper problem left with him. Jung observed that individuals in a crowd regress to a more primitive, less differentiated state of consciousness, losing the moral restraint they would exercise alone. A person who would never approach that same player on the street and scream insults into his face will do exactly that from row 40, protected by anonymity and by the diffusion of responsibility across thousands of other voices. The crowd does not just embolden cruelty, it removes the psychological cost of it, because no single person feels they did it alone. This same diffusion happens in group chats and online pile-ons, where individuals say things collectively they would never say as a single, identifiable voice standing alone in a room with the person they are attacking. Jung wrote extensively on compensation, the idea that the psyche produces reactions to balance what feels unbearable in ordinary life. Many of the loudest voices in a crowd carry a private sense of powerlessness, in their job, their finances, their relationships, places where their voice has no weight and their frustration has no outlet. The stadium offers something rare, a legitimate arena where shouting is not only allowed but expected. Booing a player becomes compensation for every moment during the week where the same person had to stay quiet, swallow a complaint, accept a decision they disagreed with. The intensity of the boo often has very little to do with the missed pass and everything to do with everything else that could not be said out loud that week. Jung noted how easily the individual conscience dissolves once a person adopts the pronoun of the collective. The fan does not say I am angry, they say we deserve better, we are being humiliated, we cannot accept this. This linguistic shift matters, because it transfers personal responsibility onto an abstraction no single person has to answer for. Nobody has to justify their own cruelty when it is spoken in the name of the collective. This exact mechanism appears in workplaces during restructuring, when a manager says the team feels this employee is underperforming, a statement that lets an individual judgment hide behind the safety of a group that never actually agreed on anything. When a fan elevates a player to the status of an idealized figure, someone who will deliver glory, meaning redemption for the club's history, they are engaging in what Jung would call an inflation of the image. The player is no longer seen realistically, he is seen as a symbol. When the symbol fails to deliver, the wound is not really about football, it is a narcissistic injury, the crowd's own fantasy of greatness collapsing in real time. Booing becomes a way of punishing the symbol for failing to protect the fan from disappointment. This is the same wound that surfaces when a mentor or a parent is idealized for years and then attacked with disproportionate bitterness the first time they turn out to be ordinary and fallible. Jung described the hero as one of the oldest archetypes in the collective unconscious, the figure who overcomes impossible odds and restores order. A talented young player is often unconsciously cast into this role by fans desperate for a savior. But the hero archetype carries a hidden condition, it demands constant proof, and offers no forgiveness for being human on an ordinary Tuesday night. The same player who is called a genius after one match is called a fraud after the next, because the crowd was never actually evaluating his football, they were measuring him against a myth no real person can sustain. This exact trap catches gifted employees labeled as the department's rising star, then quietly resented the first time their work is simply average. Workplaces run their own version of this ritual constantly. A team meeting after a failed project often becomes a search for the one person whose mistake can absorb the collective anxiety about the failure, even when the failure was structural, shared, or the result of decisions made well above that person's role. Colleagues who were silently relieved not to be the one under scrutiny will sometimes pile on with unusual enthusiasm, the same disproportionate energy visible in a stadium, because criticizing the scapegoat publicly proves, to everyone watching, that they themselves are safely outside the blame. Family systems often assign one member the unconscious role of the problem, the one whose flaws become the explanation for tension that actually belongs to the whole household. A sibling who struggles academically or emotionally can become the family's permanent scapegoat, absorbing blame for a strained marriage or long-buried resentments that have nothing to do with them. Just as the booed player did not create the club's deeper structural failures, the family scapegoat rarely created the dysfunction they are punished for, they simply happened to be the visible surface where it could be discharged. Romantic relationships are not immune to this pattern. A partner idealized early on as the one who will finally provide security, excitement, or validation the person could never generate alone will eventually fail to sustain that role, because no one can permanently perform a fantasy. The bitterness that follows often looks disproportionate to the actual disappointment, a missed birthday, a cancelled plan, because it is not really about the event. It is the private booing of someone who was cast, without their consent, as a hero, and punished the moment they turned out to be a person. Jung's answer to all of this was not moral condemnation of the crowd, but a lifelong process he called individuation, the conscious work of recognizing and reclaiming the parts of yourself you have been projecting outward. A person who understands their own capacity for failure, fear, and mediocrity has far less need to discharge it onto a stranger wearing a number on his back. This does not mean never feeling frustration at a poor performance, it means noticing when the intensity of the reaction has stopped matching the event in front of you, and asking what older, unrelated material is actually being expelled in that moment. The player who is booed off a pitch usually recovers, contracts move on, memory fades, careers continue elsewhere. What is less discussed is what the crowd loses in the act itself. Every time a group discharges its anxiety onto a convenient target instead of examining its own expectations, its own fragility, its own unlived disappointments, it forfeits a small opportunity for the kind of self-awareness Jung considered the entire point of psychological life. The scapegoat ritual offers relief but never insight. The noise fades, and the same unexamined material simply waits for the next name to attach itself to. The player standing alone on the pitch, hearing his own name turned into an insult by the people who once sang it, is not really the subject of this video. He is the mirror. What the crowd cannot bear to see in itself, its own failures, its own fear, its own unrealistic myths about salvation and greatness, gets reflected outward and punished as if it belonged to someone else entirely. This happens far beyond football. It happens in the meeting room where one employee absorbs a company's structural failure, in the family that needs one member to carry its unspoken tension, in the relationship that quietly punishes a partner for being human instead of the fantasy they were cast as. Jung's invitation was never to stop feeling disappointment. It was to notice before the noise leaves your mouth whose failure you are actually reacting to.